I've been gone for 2 weeks, vacationing after going to the front line at the lake south of Konstantinivka, filming with troops there and such. And I was doing that for a week, and then I vacationed with my family for a week after I came back to the United States. And so I missed quite a bit of updates. And the last time I was around, we were talking about Trump's new 50-day deadline. And I was saying how 50 days is quite a lot of days. And it's another delay. And as Trump keeps going from 24 hours, 100 days, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, and backing off of these red lines, he risks making his threats look completely meaningless. Meaning that a lot of times, like, a skill of diplomacy is making somebody do something with you doing nothing. Essentially, for example, somebody's going to, raise a tax on your goods. You then threaten to do something in response, and then they back off, right? You didn't have to do anything, but they believed you enough that they would back off. And so you don't have to actually engage in a back and forth price war, trade war. You can just threaten to do so and avoid it, therefore avoiding your people an expensive trade war and expending the effort you would have to make waging it and all of the resources you would have to dedicate. And the same diplomatic principle applies when it comes to establishing deterrence in foreign policy and making geopolitical adversaries believe your threats, believe your commitments, believe that the treaties that you established are treaties that you hold and will hold sacrosanct. And that is something Trump has been very bad at doing. Not only because he doesn't treat, really, it seems, any treaty as sacrosanct, but also because he makes so many threats and then fails to deliver on them, including in deadlines when it comes to this, that the 50-day ultimatum to me just seemed like we were in a waiting room just trying to see if Trump finally flips over and says, okay, we've done this enough. I'm going to stop being hopefully naive. I'm going to stop wanting either Putin to be my friend or to give me an easy time here, or waiting for something to come out in the last second. Because when you really just want the problem to go away, you will be extremely hopeful and you will try to find every opportunity. And it seems like Trump would much rather just the problem go away than deal with the problem as it is, which is part of the reason why I think he's in many instances defaulting to just calling this Biden's war, Biden's war, Biden's war. And this hopefulness is, no, I don't even think it can be called, it's not hopefulness anymore. At this point, it's naivete. And at a certain point, you have to say it cannot even be naivete. You know what's going to happen. It's just you're wishing for something that is, you're wishing for for something that is dead to come back from the dead. Okay, you're standing by your pet graveyard hoping Nibbles comes back to life. It's not going to happen. The peace deal is dead. It is buried. But we thought for a moment maybe he was making up to it, because he said, 10 to 12 days. 10 to 12 days, we're going to shorten the 50-day deadline. I still thought, again, 10 to 12 days. Why are we shortening deadlines? Why are we not just getting rid of deadlines altogether and moving straight to consequences? If you move straight to consequences, these are things you can feel immediately. These are actions that you could see a government putting into place. These are things that would be notably different than the tons of statements and words that Trump likes to proliferate amongst himself all the time, in his endless press conferences and his endless interviews and his endless threats and just words. An action would be taken differently, but then he moved to 12 to 10 days. And so some people were getting hopeful that maybe he'd finally seen the light. And then the 10 to 12 days ran up. And then we got something totally different, because again, the threat was in 10 to 12 days, we're going to give you real consequences. And instead, what we got was a summit with Vladimir Putin in the continental United States. So not only are we going to be ending Putin's isolation by having him meet with the American president for the first time since the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine for its large-scale invasion back in 2022. Of course, there was the other invasion back in 2014. But we're going to be doing it on the borders of the continental United States and Alaska, a former Russian territory that they could make as equal legal claims to in reference to Ukraine. We're going to be meeting with President Vladimir Putin, where in many other places he would be arrested, as he is currently wanted by the International Criminal Court for the trafficking of Ukrainian children. So we're going to be holding this meeting. There's no new consequence. A deadline turns into another deadline for a meeting with Vladimir Putin this Friday in Alaska. So that means another week of no action. And then when it comes to the end of this weekend, after this Friday, then maybe something will happen. So to me, this is the Russian song and dance. This is the continuation of the same beat that I hope you guys are looking at, which is the Russians are trying to dance the United States to death. They are trying to constantly engage in diplomacy, constantly engage in dialogue, while adding as much pressure as possible to the front line, continuing the offensives, changing none of their behavior on the ground, but talking like any day now, they might take something seriously. They have not compromised their position when it comes to territory. They have not compromised their position when it comes to disarmament. They have not compromised their position when it comes to, Ukrainian culture or identifying the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government. They have not changed their position, even when it comes to a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, a meeting between the presidents that they're supposedly able to make peace. They have not pushed forward on any of this, but they continue to go back and forth. They continue to talk. Hey, there's a trade of dead bodies here, even though the Ukrainians accuse some of the dead bodies actually being Russian soldiers that have been turned over. Hey, there was a prisoner exchange, even though there was prisoner exchanges before this. These are shown as gigantic diplomatic achievements, because even though they are more sizable, because it hasn't been able to turn out any other benefit for the last 7 months of failed peacemaking. And so what the Russians are trying to do is, hey, we've delayed it another week. And not only have we delayed it another week, we get to have a big meeting between Trump and Putin himself. And hey, if Putin can make Trump believe Russian security assessments over the American intelligence community in Helsinki during the first term, why could Putin not convince Trump of other things during this meeting in the second term? The same guy who was convinced that the Ukrainians were encircled at Kursk when they weren't. Where did they get that? Got it from the Russians. Where else could they have gotten it? The same administration that had its peace envoy, Steve Witkoff, use a Russian translator, as in a translator provided by the Russians in a room alone with all of Russia's biggest advisors for Vladimir Putin and Putin himself. This game, they just want to keep on extending, because if they can delay it, even if 3 months down the line, after 3 more months of failed peacemaking, Trump finally says, fine, we'll do something. That something will probably be after Pokrovsk fell. That something may be after Konstantinivka fell, and the little last bits of Toretsk and Chasiv Yar were taken. The Chasiv Yar suburb, since the city itself is largely taken, and the pieces of Toretsk that somehow resist despite it all. And at that point, what are you going to do? Rush new amounts of aid? Even if you click the sanctions into place, then sanctions do take time to not only take effect, but also to register throughout the Russian economy and then transfer from the Russian economy to the Russian war machine and to everyday Russians. So time is of the essence. And I remember being told by different Trump supporters, oh, you can wait a little bit longer, let's just hope for the best. But we've been waiting for 7 months. That's over half a year. A lot of people die in over half a year of warfare. A lot of people perish between the start of 44 and the midpoint of 44, and the midpoint of 44 and the end of 1944. A lot of people can die in 6 to 7 months, and there's no end in sight. There's a good reason to believe that the war is going to continue throughout the entirety of 2025 into 2026, going towards the midterms. And the closer we get to the midterms, the more fearful I am about Trump's commitment to actually pull on any of these sanctions that he has yet to pull on, with the Indian sanctions being the closest we have ever got, which is still 1.5 miles away from the 500% threats that he was making on the campaign trail, or even the 100% correction when he was trying to reel in the Senate to be weaker on the economic response. So, we are deep into the Trump presidency, and we have yet to see the actions that are needed to be taken to force the Russians to the negotiating table, to bring about the end that even Trump supposedly wants. And so what do we do with that? What are we supposed to do with that? What am I supposed to do with that? Am I supposed to just, okay, we're just going to wait and just hope for Trump to eventually get around to it? I mean, you would hope there'd be a bigger public response. You would hope Capitol Hill would show a bigger response if they show its spine to him within the Republican Party. The Republicans who are pro-Ukraine have been taken on a ride by Trump again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And now we're headed towards a summit, which is now going to be used by another opportunity by Putin to try to derail more pressure being put on the Russians, or if there is more pressure put on the Russians, just make it softer pressure. Oh, Trump, I couldn't deal with a 100% tariff. Just do 20%. We'll keep talking and just do 20% and increase it every 6 months. He'll do something to try to undermine it. And so it's a question of whether Trump will have the wherewithal and the sense to see through that, or if he even has the motivation to see through that. And now those Republicans, they might be taken on a ride again and again and again. And so we are waiting for the summit to happen. And what's interesting about the summit is it was organized after a meeting between Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin. And Steve Witkoff believed that he had made a big breakthrough. And so then the report came out like, hey, guys, there's going to be a big meeting between Putin, Zelensky, and Trump. But then that quickly changed and said, Putin, Zelensky, and Trump. What we really meant was Trump and Putin. And now it wasn't just, press releases. It was Trump himself. There's a high likelihood that the meeting will take place very soon. But that changed to, it isn't really necessary by the end of August 7th. It isn't really necessary that the meeting has to just be between Trump and Putin. It could really be between, it can be behind Trump, Putin, and Zelensky. But if it is just Trump and Putin, that's not a problem.
Does Putin have to meet with Zelensky in order and before you and Putin have to meet? Or
No.
Are you hoping
So you're willing to, that's actually important because President Putin said this morning he was pretty dismissive of this idea of meeting with President
Who was?
Zelensky. President Putin was.
I don't know. I didn't hear
For you
him.
to meet with him, he doesn't have to agree to meet with Zelensky. Is that what you're saying?
No, he doesn't. No.
So when do you think that meeting?
They would like to meet with me, and I'll do whatever I can to stop the killing. So last month, they lost 14,000 people killed last month. Every week is 4,000 or 5,000 people. So I don't like long waits. I think it's a shame. And they're mostly soldiers. They're Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, and some people from the cities where, missiles are lobbed in and you'll lose 35, 40 people a night, which is terrible. But no, mostly it's soldiers, and you're talking about, on average, 20,000 a month. 20,000 people are dying a month. Young, generally young people.
A lot of them older too. But listen to that from Trump. He doesn't have to meet with Zelensky. No, he doesn't. If that's the case, then expecting the Russians to respect Ukrainian state sovereignty, expecting the Russians to view the Ukrainians as an independent state, as an independent culture, until they can recognize the Ukrainian government, interact with the Ukrainian government, how do you expect them not to go to war if they can't even sit down and look at each other? And this was, remember, at the start of this, it was, it's going to be so hard to get Zelensky to come to the table. And the entire presidency has just been Trump trying to find any way he can entice Putin to the table, as he is terrified, absolutely terrified of stepping into the same room as Volodymyr Zelensky, either due to the legitimacy he thinks that would rub off on Zelensky, or maybe he thinks Zelensky would somehow embarrass him. I do not know, but he is terrified of it. And I think the legitimacy angle is probably the strongest. And so I think we're already off to a bad start if this meeting in Alaska isn't even going to be a trilateral meeting. The Ukrainians still aren't there. It's going to be Putin and Trump. That's already going to be a problem. But then we got an aide to Putin saying that the U.S. has made a proposal that the Russian side considers acceptable. And Steve Witkoff was coming out saying, hey, we're actually really close to a breakthrough, and this is what spawned this Alaska conference in the first place. Let me show you what the Putin aide said. The proposal from the Americans seems quite acceptable to us. And where is a possible meeting place? Well, I cannot say yet, although in principle, it'll be there. You said days, not weeks. Approximately, yes, next week, this week now. Now we're going to work. Where will it take place? I just said. Rubio said that now there is something to discuss. So our signals. Rubio is right. Okay, so good signs. Something acceptable. Trump was even saying, hey, maybe we have a call. We have a meeting in Rome. We have a meeting here, a meeting there. But eventually they agree to have a meeting in Alaska, the United States. But then a pin dropped, because what we were hearing originally, or what was being boasted, is like a sort of land swap. And this is still being talked about by Trump, a certain land swap. But the idea that was suggested for the land swap, and that was originally told to Europe, was that Russia would get Donetsk and Luhansk in exchange for full control of Kherson and Zaporizhia for the Ukrainians, which is not a great deal. It's all Ukrainian territory, but it is the Russians giving up cities like Mariupol. It is the Russians giving Ukraine a decent portion to what would look like possibly even like a 50% to a majority of their coastline back. That would mean cities like Zaporizhia and the city of Kherson would no longer be within artillery range. Zaporizhia would not be able to go within artillery range. That would not get within it. And Kherson, like the human safari, would face a lot of problems. It would also mean that the Russians would be willing to concede a land corridor to Crimea in order to find peace, which would be an indication of at least some conciliatory posture. Not necessarily a posture of, okay, look, this is a bad idea, but a posture of like, okay, let's wrap this up. But then that picture that was painted for European leaders, and that European leaders and Ukrainians were like, oh, we got to think about it. I mean, we're not really necessarily comfortable with this, because you have to give up Kramatorsk. And Kramatorsk is a city that is not controlled by the Russians and is pretty defensible. And you'd have to give up Slovyansk, and you'd have to give up Konstantinivka, and you have to give up the rest of Toretsk. You'd have to give up the rest of the, suburban area of Chasiv Yar. You'd have to give up Mirorad. You'd have to give up Dobropila. You'd have to give up all of the rest of Donetsk, which holds some pretty defensible positions, meaning that you would be opening up other regions for future attacks, as well as signing away a bunch of people's homes without a fight. So this is a decision that is not necessarily going to be made by the Ukrainians. This is a decision that the Ukrainians might decide due to a lack of trust of the Russians, or because they're not willing to tell Ukrainians to leave their homes to give it up, especially when we're talking about the Donetsk region, a region that's been particularly brutalized by the Russians. Before we could even have that conversation about the dynamics of whether or not this is a deal that should be taken, Kelborn, thank you for the tier 2. I appreciate that. Witkoff then the next day was like, wait a second. Never mind, during a call with the chief aides of these different EU leaders, saying that actually Russia would both withdraw and then like freeze the front. And then European officials were like, wait a second, what's going on? So they demand a third call with him to clarify what's going on. And in that call, he then clarifies that the only offer on the table currently is that Ukraine withdraws from the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in exchange for a ceasefire, meaning Ukraine does not get back Mariupol. Ukraine does not get back the rest of Kherson. Ukraine does not have necessarily the human safari put out of possibility. Ukraine pulls out of Luhansk and Donetsk with some of the most defensible positions in the country in exchange for a ceasefire that could cease within a month. And the ceasefire could cease is not the greatest language, but the ceasefire could stop within a month. It could reignite. So give up your defensible positions for us to stop fighting. In exchange for nothing. Big fat nothing. And we could restart fighting within a few months. Because there's no security guarantees attached to this. They want neutrality. They want all the X, Y, and the Z, the same stuff they've been asking for as always. And so it seems like a peace conference was started in Alaska based off of Steve Witkoff either misinterpreting what the Russians were willing to offer or having the worst case of naivete that has ever, but really I think it was either a miscalculation or him trying to force a confrontation over this, where Trump is in a position where he has to call out somebody, he has to pull the rug as to why his diplomatic effort did not succeed, and maybe that'll end up being Ukraine. Either way, though, it seems like his confusion and Steve Witkoff's lack of knowledge about what region is what, as he showed on the Tucker Carlson podcast, he doesn't even know what region he wants to give up to the Russians. He's now confusingly like saying, oh, land swamp to never mind land swap. So he's starting conferences based off of deals he does not understand, which shows that the Russians have not compromised their position at all before we had this new conference. So currently, all signs point towards this conference failing, just like the last attempts at diplomacy with the Russians have failed, because nothing has fundamentally changed since then. Here is Trump trying to talk about this territory and these land swaps, and the way he talks about it, it sounds like he's talking about territory from not only like a real estate perspective, but he's talking about coastline. So this is making me think he's talking about Kherson and Zaporizhia, which again are territories that, according to Steve Witkoff now, not Steve Witkoff a couple of days ago, is not willing to be traded. And now we're hearing Trump again, talking like Trump at the start of the administration. We're going to try to get back as much as we can. I don't know where this Trump went away from. I mean, this Trump disappeared.
Bad. But it's very complex because you have lines that are very uneven, and there'll be some swapping, there'll be some changes in land, and the word that they will use is, they make changes. We're going to change the lines, the battle lines. Russia's occupied a big portion of Ukraine. They've occupied some very prime territory. We're going to try and get some of that territory back for Ukraine. But they've taken some very prime territory. They've taken largely ocean. In real estate, we call it oceanfront property. That's always the most valuable property. If you're in a lake, a river, or an ocean, it's always the best property. Well, Ukraine, a lot of people don't know that Ukraine was largely 1,000 miles of ocean. That's gone. Other than one small area, Odessa, it's a small area. There's just a little bit of water left. So I'm going to go and see the parameters. Now, I may leave and say, good luck. And that'll
I love Odessa. Eat at Mr. Butter. They serve a good steak.
be the end. I may say this is not going to be settled. I mean, there are...
Listen to that at the end, though.
And say, good luck. I'm going to go and see the parameters. Now, I may leave and say, good luck. And that'll be the end. I may say this is not going to be settled.
I might leave and say good luck, and this isn't going to be settled. So Trump is readily preparing through his press statements that this might be a catastrophe. So there's no breakthrough. The way they talked about this deal, it sounded like there was a significant shift, a big breakthrough had occurred, that now the Russians, Trump had finally, through diplomatic vigor, had gotten them to concede to something. They agreed to a big meeting in the United States. That's the way Steve Witkoff was talking. That's what they were telling EU leaders. And now all of a sudden, it looks like they're not willing to concede anything. They want the Ukrainians to withdraw from territory that the Russians had not even, taken by force. And now Trump is talking as if, it might work, it might not work. It looks like, to me, honestly, this is doomed to fail from the start. Trump doesn't have confidence in it. Steve Witkoff is flip-flopping on exactly what even was on the table. The Russians have seemingly not shifted their position whatsoever. We see the Russians breaking through some kilometers in some areas in the Pokrovsk area to the northeast of that, towards the Dobropila-Kramatorsk highway. And the Russians are continuing to put maximum pressure across the front line. This is not conditions that are strong for diplomacy. If Trump had done something else to, hey, I've added some new sanction that makes it so the Russians can't continue the war for another 6 to 12 months. So they have to take something. Hey, you know, boom, now you've changed the calculations. Trump hasn't done anything. Trump keeps putting forward deadlines that then expire that, like, hey, this is the time to talk. And by the 10th, if you don't talk to me, we'll have another deadline by which you'll have to talk to me. It's not diplomacy. It's not pressure. And at the same time, the administration and Trump, you know, he might not be paying a lot of attention to this. The Russians are. They're continuing to appoint people who are completely comfortable with Russian domination over Ukraine, continuing to send signals to the Russians that, again, just wait them out. Joe Kent, this guy just got a vote to lead the National Counterterrorism Center, and he said that it's perfectly reasonable that Donetsk and Luhansk go to the Russians. So why wouldn't they make that core demand if they don't see the United States willing to take action, if they see people being chosen for positions who are saying that it's okay if they keep Donetsk and Luhansk, when they know the vice president doesn't really care, and he said that openly on the campaign trail, why wouldn't they think that they could hold out without, again, an action to make them think otherwise? A strong action, not a slap of the wrist on India.
Laid out what he wants in Ukraine. It's a decent starting point. Now, taking control of the provinces, the Russian-speaking provinces to the east of Donetsk and Luhansk, that's very reasonable. Those provinces are already Russian-speaking and want to break off anyways. Having some form of a ceasefire.
They speak Russian. They want to be Russian. We speak English. We all want to be English. We all want to be British. If you go to Ireland, you see anybody speaking English, go up to them and say, hello, I didn't know you were British, and shake their hand. If they punch you, that means they're your friend. This is the people, these types, these unknowledgeable knuckle draggers are the ones getting appointed up and down the State Department and different diplomatic positions. And look, this is the NATO ambassador. If you think it's just going to be people like that, like the lower-level diplomats or lower-level government officials that are going to be making these mess-ups, this is a guy who's chosen just to speak. He is NATO ambassador Matthew Whitaker. This is a man whose job it is to represent the United States at NATO and, you know, keep the peace and advocate for America's interests. And when he is asked about this land swap, about this trading of territory here, trading of territory there, he says that no big chunks or sections are going to be given that haven't been fought for or earned. Probably the worst wording, earned on the battlefield.
Certainly, I think, you know, I took Zelensky's comments at face value, which is that no big chunks or, you know, sections are going to be just given that haven't been fought for or earned on the battlefield. You know, but I come back to where I started, which is, you know, we need this war to end. We could save thousands of lives with a deal. And I think that by both sides communicating, by President Trump meeting in Alaska on Friday with either one or both of the combatants, I think this is exciting, and I think President Trump's really the only one that could make this happen. You know, he's the sole reason I think this meeting is happening on Friday. He's a peacemaker. You know, he's averaging about a peace deal a month right now. We saw just this week where Armenia and Azerbaijan came together to settle their decades-long conflict. It's been a series of peace deals, and so I think President.
By the way, again, the president of Azerbaijan has said that it's not formalized until there's constitutional changes in Armenia's constitution. Trump has a tendency of getting ahead of himself on these peace deals. It's like, hey, we found peace between Israel and Iran, and the bombing immediately continued. All he has to do is just keep your mouth shut just for a little bit until you know for sure everything's settled. But no, he likes to run to the presses.
I think President Trump is best situated to see if a deal can be had and if both sides can agree to ending the slaughter.
Okay, so to be clear, earned on the battlefield. So just throwing this out there. If Hamas did take Tel Aviv and then started doing exactly what you would expect them to do there, like shooting any number of civilians, you'd imagine to see a certain amount of atrocities, maybe some sexual violence. Like that's earned. Would we say earned on the battlefield? Is this the way we would talk about it? It was earned on the battlefield. You know, this is going to be part of the future state down there because it was earned on the battlefield. Earned on the battlefield is not. You would not say that the Nazis earned Warsaw on the battlefield. You would not say the Soviet. I don't like this language. I don't like this language because it's the language of if the Russians can take it, the Russians can have it. And I don't think that's the type of language we want the Russians to be hearing, which this being NATO ambassador, American ambassador to NATO, they're certainly listening. They're certainly listening. And these are the types of tones that match very well with what the Russians would like to see and how they view European affairs. Have to be earned on the battlefield. Okay, you want to know how I think that this is going to go down? You want to know my honest view about how this is going to go down? This Alaska meeting. I'll give you what I think is going to happen, beat by beat. I'm still hearing that there's a possibility that Zelensky can go to this meeting. Originally, Trump said Zelensky was going to be there. I didn't believe it then, and I hear them now responding to the kind of backlash of, oh, now it's just a Trump-Putin meeting by saying, oh, well, maybe he'll be there. Well, maybe he'll video call in. You know, they're just trying to find some out. I don't think Zelensky's going to be there. I don't. I think it'll be a Trump-Putin summit. I think Trump and Putin will have a private audience where they will talk afterwards. Trump will talk to the press. Whether he will talk to the press with Putin will be of something of interest to look at, because if he does, the press are probably, as long as they're not handpicked goons, going to ask some interesting question in the presence of each other. Ask him about crimes that Putin committed. If you know he's wanted by the International Criminal Court, do you think he should be arrested? And Trump is going to be tested there, and I don't expect him to come out too hard against Putin in that environment. I really don't. I think Putin's good at buttering him up, and he's had a success in doing it before. I think that Trump is much better when he's outside of his. Remember Norm Macdonald, who used to say, like, people talk about going back in time with the time machine to kill Hitler, but I was always afraid of that, because if I went back there, I'm afraid I'd join him, because I'd fall under the power of his dark, powerful gaze. You know, and Trump has to get out of his dark, powerful gaze and be surrounded by Marco Rubio and Keith Kellogg, and be like, come on, man, he's disrespecting you. He's disrespecting you, man. He's saying you can't make peace, man. He's saying you don't know what you're doing. He says he's gonna do a ceasefire, then he doesn't do a ceasefire. He heard 24 hours. He heard your commitments, man. They need to get in there. They need to be like a hype man. Get him in there. But I think they're gonna have that summit. I think he's gonna pat Trump on the back. I think he's gonna attempt really hard to both either delay sanctions, avoid sanctions entirely, or even better, change Trump's thinking on the issue and try to get Trump to pressure the Ukrainians. And the deal that I think is going to end up getting pushed is a land swap, quote unquote, where the Ukrainians give up the rest of Luhansk and Donetsk for the Russians giving up back to Ukraine the rest of Sumy and Kharkiv. Now in Sumy, the Russians are currently getting pushed back pretty hard. So the Russians currently on the back foot in Sumy. Giving up the rest of Sumy doesn't seem like that big of a deal. And there's not really any pathway forward for them to like advance on Sumy. If they were able to break through, they might be able to put Sumy within artillery range, but then what does that mean? You get to blow up a bunch of civilian houses again. You get to do a bunch of, a bunch of GDP damage to Ukraine. There's not like a pathway to taking it. Plus the Sumy locals all hate the Russians. There's not really, I've never heard of a Sumy waiter. I'm sure there's somewhere, but I've never met them. And in Kharkiv, I think it would probably be the most helpful for Kupiansk, but Vovchansk is like a ruin right now. And the Russians are still fighting for Vovchansk. Whereas when we talk about Kramatorsk and what the Ukrainians would have to give up, we're talking about a city of like 100,000 people or something like approximately around that. And then you have the neighboring city of Slovyansk. Then you have Dobropila. Then you still have Pokrovsk, and Mirograd, which those surrounded on three sides has still not been taken. You have Konstantinivka. You've got places that are still within Ukrainian control, that the Ukrainians can make the Russians fight for, and that there are ways to defend them moving forward. For example, Kramatorsk and Slovyansk are probably the two cities that are now the de facto, they're twin cities, and Kramatorsk is the de facto capital of Donetsk. Many people in Donetsk have fled the rest of the Donetsk region or from Donetsk city and gone to Kramatorsk, and it's their home, and they don't want to flee again, and it's somewhat defensible. And much of Ukraine's defenses that have been built in this area. So do they want to give up those defenses? Do they want to make those people leave those homes again? And now you're going to do it for nothing in return, but a few burnt down villages in Sumy, which the Russians are currently on the back foot in. Vovchansk, which is completely burnt to the ground at this point. Lipsy, same thing. And we remove pressure from Kupiansk, and you get some villages around there. It just, and definitely considering there's no real defensible positions in these locations that are going to be taken back too. So it's giving up something that's not that defensively useful and doesn't house a lot of people for the last part of Free Donetsk, which has many more people and much more defenses. And is again one step forward in Russia's goal to take Zaporizhia, is Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, and Zaporizhia and Kherson. There is no statement from the Russians that they are giving up on those goals. So it could just be another step forward in the achievement of those goals while using Sumy and Kharkiv, which they very well just could invade again to try to advance forward again. There's no reason that they couldn't invade Kherson, Zaporizhia, then invade Sumy and Kharkiv and try to do the whole deal all over again within a few years. So that's the deal that I'm looking at, that I think the Russians will probably be, if they make a deal, that's the deal that I expect to see. And I also think that's the deal that the Ukrainians will reject for both the giving up of the defensive positions, how it clearly is Russia still advancing towards its goals of conquering more and more Ukrainian territory. Again, there's more people there, and the defenses. It just does not make sense. Not to mention, Donetsk has gone through enough. How much of the captured territory is usable still? Like I talk about with Kramatorsk is still a city that's alive. Vovchansk is a city that is dead. That is the difference. One day, hopefully, Vovchansk will breathe again, but currently it is dead. And that is what many people in Kramatorsk fear happening to them. But they also don't want people going room by room, door by door, finding anybody who sympathized with their national culture. Okay.